When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. My hands were shaking, but I kept them folded in my lap like I used to do during long prayers. I could hear the clock in the living room, a soft ticking. The day was bright, but it felt like evening inside me. My son stood by the doorway, his eyes moving between her face and mine. He looked tired. I wanted to reach for his hand. I wanted to say, "It is all right, Beta, I will go if it brings peace." But my throat felt tight, and the words did not come. I had lived in that house for 6 years. I knew the sound of the hallway light when it flickered. I knew which kitchen drawer stuck in summer. I knew how the floor creaked near the guest room. I knew these things better than the back of my own hands. Yet I sat there like a guest who had stayed too long. My suitcase was already near the door. I had packed it slowly the night before, folding each sari, each shawl. I put my hair oil in a small bottle. I wrapped the framed photo of my husband with an old scarf so it would not break. I told myself this was only a little trip. I told myself I needed a change of air. I told myself lies to keep my heart from breaking. She spoke in a steady voice, not loud, not cruel. A voice that wanted to be fair. She said we needed space. She said the house felt heavy with 2 women managing the same rooms. She said the baby needed calm. That word stayed in the air like a note on a flute. I thought of all the nights I had held that baby to my chest and hummed the lullaby my mother taught me. I thought of the warm breath against my cheek and the little hands clutching my blouse. Calm. I wondered if I had become noise. My son did not speak. He kept rubbing the back of his neck. He has my husband's habit of doing that when he is unsure. For a second, I saw him as a boy again, standing at the school gate with a broken shoelace looking for me. But the boy was gone. In his place stood a man who wanted to be a good husband, a good father, and perhaps he believed a good son by choosing silence. I wanted to say, I never wished to rule this house. I wanted to say I was only trying to help. I wanted to say I loved the smell of baby powder more than my morning tea. But the moment had its own script. And in that script, I did not have many lines. I reached for my handbag. The leather felt cold. I picked up the keys and placed them on the table. The key ring had a small brass temple bell that made a kind, soft sound like a farewell. I stood up and smoothed the front of my faded green kurta. The sunlight on the floor looked like water. I felt I could step into it and disappear. She looked at me almost as if asking me to bless this decision. I wanted to be larger than my pain. I wanted to become a mother who could smile at anything. I tried to hold her gaze with softness, the way I would hold the edge of a delicate glass. My lips curved into a small smile, and I nodded. The nod said, "All right." The nod said, "You will not have to explain again." The nod said, "I will make this easy for you, my child." There is a quiet that comes right before a goodbye. It is not empty. It is full of all the things you wanted to say but could not. It is full of all the meals you cooked and the floors you swept and the small kindnesses that went unnoticed because that is the way of home. It is also full of small hurts, comments that were almost nothing but not nothing, looks that stayed in the room after the people left, doors that closed a little too quickly. The quiet holds it all. I stood in that quiet and let it wash over me. My son moved then. He picked up the suitcase. He did not look at me. He said he would call a taxi. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I could not tell if he was ashamed or simply afraid of what the next minute might ask of him. I watched his shoulders tense. I wanted to touch his arm and say, "You have carried me long enough. Put it down." But I did not move. I stood still because I understood that sometimes love means not touching the wound. The baby woke up in the next room and gave a small cry. It was the soft cry between sleep and waking, the one that can be calmed by a familiar smell. I turned my head without meaning to. My daughter-in-law went to the room. She came back with the baby in her arms. The small face flushed with sleep, the hair damp and sweet, the eyes not fully open. My arms ached to hold that weight. I took a step, then stopped. She adjusted the baby on her shoulder and looked at me with a tired kind of patience. I smiled again, smaller this time, almost a breath, and whispered inside my chest, "Be strong." When I stepped out of the front door, the late morning air touched my face. The street smelled of wet leaves. Somewhere a tap was dripping. A man pushed a cart of gavas and called out in a voice that had sung the same note for years. I felt the ground steady beneath me. I stood on the little step and looked back through the open doorway, not with anger, not even with hurt, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. How did we come to this? When did the thread begin to fray? When did my loving become a burden? The taxi arrived and the driver got out to load the suitcase. I told him I would sit in the back seat. He nodded and opened the door. I slid in and placed my handbag on my lap. My fingers traced the stitching on the leather. I took a deep breath and tasted salt, though I had not cried. The door of the house was still open. My son stood in the doorway, a shadow behind the light. Our eyes met for a second. I did not blame him. I did not blame her. I did not even blame myself. Blame felt too heavy for that narrow street. As the taxi moved, the house grew smaller. My throat loosened, and a single thought came to me, not like a knife, but like a slow, gentle rain. This is the day my daughter-in-law turned my son against me. And yet, somewhere underneath that sentence, a softer one pressed its face to the window of my heart and refused to leave. Perhaps the truth is more fragile than that. Perhaps the house itself turned us against each other. Perhaps love, when crowded, loses its air. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I did not look back again. The city moved around me, people with bags, buses with faces pressed to the glass, a child holding a balloon shaped like the moon. I let the world pass through me without leaving marks. I thought of the baby's small hand opening and closing in sleep. I thought of my son's first day at school. I thought of my husband's laugh when he forgot the words to an old song. The taxi turned at the crossing, and I held onto the strap above the window. I smiled again, not because I was brave, but because sometimes a smile is the only umbrella you have when you do not know when the rain will stop. The taxi dropped me at the small house I had rented years ago after my husband's passing. It was a simple one, bedroom place on the edge of the town, where the mornings smelled of wet grass and the evenings echoed with distant train whistles. I had kept it locked, paying a kind neighbor to dust it once a month. It was my quiet place, the one I used to visit when I needed to be alone with my thoughts. Now, it was my home again. I opened the door and the air inside was still. Dust hung like fine threads in the sunlight. The curtains had faded and the old wall clock had stopped at 3:15. I put my bag on the chair and stood for a while, letting the silence fill me. There was something comforting about it. No footsteps, no voices, just the slow breathing of the empty house. I boiled water for tea on the old gas stove. The kettle whistled weakly, like it had forgotten how. I poured the tea into a chipped white cup and sat near the window. From there, I could see the narrow lane lined with hibiscus bushes and children's bicycles. A woman passed by with a basket of laundry balanced on her head. Somewhere, a radio was playing in an old love song. Life outside had not changed much. It was my heart that had. As I sipped the tea, I let my mind wander back. I remembered the day my son was born, the cry that filled the hospital room, the way my husband held him as if he were made of glass. We had not been rich, but we were happy. My husband worked long hours as a teacher, and I stitched clothes for neighbors to earn a little extra. Our joy was simple. An evening meal together, my son's laughter echoing through the small house, the three of us sitting under the fan on hot nights, talking about nothing. When my husband passed away, my son was only 17. He stood by my side through the rituals, trying to be strong for both of us. I remember him lighting the pyre, his eyes dry, his lips trembling. I held his hand and whispered, "You have done what your father would be proud of." He nodded, but I could feel the storm inside him. After that, it was just the two of us. I watched him grow into a man, responsible, kind, and full of quiet dreams. He studied hard, got a good job in the city, and one day he came home with a girl. She was polite, soft-spoken, with bright eyes that seemed to notice everything. She touched my feet the first time we met. I remember feeling such warmth for her, thinking, my son has chosen well. Their wedding was small but beautiful. The laughter, the music, the smell of jasmine in her hair, everything felt perfect. When they moved into a new house, they insisted I come live with them. I had hesitated at first, but my son said, "You're my mother. Where else will you go?" I smiled and agreed. I thought I was stepping into a new chapter of family life. I didn't know how quietly, how slowly chapters can turn into lessons. At first, everything was smooth. She would cook breakfast and I would make tea. We would talk about recipes, plants, the baby names she liked for the future. I used to help her with the laundry, fold the clothes while she watched her shows. I loved how she filled the house with energy, singing softly as she worked, rearranging things to her liking. I didn't mind it. I thought, she's young, she should feel this house is hers. But time has its own way of changing voices. Small things began to sound sharper. If I added a little salt in the curry, she would say, "We don't eat too salty now." If I forgot to close a drawer, she would sigh, "It's okay, I'll do it." They were small things, but they gathered like drops before rain. My son never said much. He worked late, came home tired, and smiled faintly before going to bed. I told myself not to trouble him. Then came the baby, a tiny bundle of light. When I first held her, I felt my heart open like it hadn't in years. Her small fingers gripped mine with such trust. I would rock her to sleep, sing to her, whisper little prayers over her head. The nights were long but peaceful. I thought motherhood had returned to me, only softer this time. But slowly, the rhythm changed again. My daughter-in-law began to guard her space more. She would take the baby from my arms even when I had just put her to sleep. "I'll do it, Ma," she would say, smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I began to feel like a guest again. I would wait for the baby's cry, hoping to be needed, but often she would go before me. I told myself it was only adjustment, that all mothers and daughters-in-law have these invisible walls. Still, something inside me ached. Each time she drew a line I didn't see coming. One evening, while I was feeding the baby, she walked in and said softly, "Please don't give her anything other than what the doctor said." Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't gentle either. I nodded, but I felt something break quietly inside me, not anger, just a deep sadness, the kind that doesn't show. After she left, I looked at the baby's face. I whispered, "You'll understand one day, my little one. Love sometimes doesn't fit in the same room." That night, I sat by the window and thought of my husband. I imagined what he would say if he were here. Maybe he would laugh softly and say, "You're too sensitive, dear." Maybe he would tell me to be patient, that love needs time to learn new languages. But sometimes, no matter how much time you give it, it keeps speaking in silence. When I went to bed that night, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't hostility. It was distance, the quiet kind that grows between people who once shared everything. And I realized then that love doesn't always fade with fights or shouting. Sometimes it just quietly forgets to look you in the eyes. The days that followed began to move differently. They were slower, quieter, but also sharper, like walking barefoot on small pieces of glass. Nothing big, nothing bleeding, but enough to make every step careful. I woke up earlier than anyone else, out of habit. I would make tea for all three of us, just like before. But now the cups stayed untouched longer. Some mornings, she would come to the kitchen after me and quietly pour hers down the sink. She would brew her own, adding ginger and honey the way she liked. I never said anything. I only started making 2 cups instead of 3. When my son came home from work, I noticed he stopped asking me how my day was, not out of rudeness. He was just tired or distracted or maybe unsure of what to say. We would sit together sometimes, but his eyes often went to his phone, reading messages or replying quickly before putting it face down on the table. I would ask about his office, about the baby's new things, about anything at all, but most answers came in short words. Good, Ma. Yes, Ma. No, Ma. It wasn't anger, it was something colder, something emptier. My daughter-in-law kept herself busy. She joined an online group for new mothers, started baking cakes to sell, and talked to her friends on video calls. I heard laughter from her room, laughter that once filled the whole house. I miss that sound even though it still existed, just not with me. One afternoon, I was folding the baby's clothes when I heard her on the phone. She didn't know I was nearby. Her voice was low, but the words found their way to me through the half-open door. She said, "It's just hard sometimes." She means well, but it's too much. Every time I do something, she has another way. I feel like I can't breathe in my own home. There was a pause. Then she said, "No, she's not bad. She's just always there." I froze, the little pink frock in my hands suddenly heavy, always there. That's what I was, a shadow that lingered too long in the light. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My eyes didn't fill with tears. Not then. They just stayed wide, as if trying to see something far away. That evening, she avoided my eyes. She was kind, polite, even gentle, but something had shifted. It was like walking into a room where someone had just spoken about you, the air still holding the echo. My son didn't notice, or maybe he did and didn't want to. When he smiled at her across the dinner table, I saw love, young, strong, determined, and I understood then that I was standing at the edge of something sacred to them. I had become the extra word in a sentence that was already complete. A few days later, there was another small moment. I had washed some of the baby's clothes and hung them outside. The wind was soft, and the sun was gentle that morning. When she came out and saw them, she said quietly, "Ma, next time, please don't use the detergent on her clothes. It irritates her skin. I'll handle her laundry." I nodded again, smiled even, but my chest tightened. These weren't insults. These were boundaries. Walls built not with anger, but with need. And every wall I respected took me a little farther away from them. That night, I sat alone in the small balcony after everyone slept. The street light flickered. I listened to the faint hum of cars far away. The baby's soft breathing from the other room reached me like a lullaby I wasn't supposed to hear. I whispered to myself, maybe this is what life does. It gives you love to raise, and when it grows strong enough, it walks away to make room for more love. I tried to believe it. But belief is a slow thing. It doesn't come just because you say the right words. The next morning, I made Hawa for breakfast. Her favorite, or at least it used to be. When she saw it, she smiled politely. "Oh, Ma, I'm trying to cut down on sugar," she said. I laughed lightly and said, "Just a spoonful," for sweetness in the deity. But she didn't take any. My son ate quietly, avoiding my eyes. I looked at him and asked, "Do you remember how your father used to love this?" He nodded without looking up. "Yes, Ma, that was all." It was after breakfast that I felt something inside me begin to fade. Not love. Love doesn't leave so easily. But the energy to keep proving that love, that began to run out. I started spending more time in my room. I read old letters, rearranged photo albums, watered the plants. I told myself I was giving them space. I told myself they needed time to build their own rhythm. But sometimes when you give people space, they start to fill it with silence. One afternoon, my son came home early. His face was tense. I was sitting in the living room, mending a small tear in the baby's blanket. He stood there for a moment before saying softly, "Ma, can we talk?" I looked up. "Of course, Beta." He hesitated. "It's nothing serious, just maybe give us some time alone these days. She's been feeling overwhelmed. You know how first-time mothers are." I nodded slowly, my needle frozen in the fabric. "Yes, I understand." He sighed with relief. "You're the best, Ma." When he walked away, I looked down at the blanket. The tear I had been fixing was small, barely noticeable. I finished stitching it and ran my fingers over the seam. It looked fine from the outside, but I knew it wasn't the same anymore. The next few weeks were full of small absences. She began taking the baby to her mother's house often. Sometimes she stayed overnight. My son would call me from there, saying he'd be late or not coming home. I pretended not to mind. I said things like, "That's good. She should spend time with her family." But inside, it felt like the walls of my heart were being slowly rearranged, making more room for loneliness. One evening, when they returned, I noticed how naturally she greeted her mother on the phone, warm, comfortable, effortless. I smiled at that, but then I thought of how careful her words were with me, soft, polite, but distant. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, thinking of all the ways love changes its face. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it avoids your eyes. It was around that time that she started avoiding me during meals. She said she preferred to eat later after feeding the baby. So I would eat alone, washing the dishes quietly so the clinking wouldn't wake the child. My son still kissed my forehead before leaving for work, but even that felt like a ritual now, something done because it always had been. One morning, I overheard them talking softly in their room. She said, "It's just not working, Arjun. I can't live like this. I feel like I'm being watched all the time." He said, "She's my mother, Ria. What do you want me to do?" "I know she's your mother," she said. "But this isn't her house anymore. It's ours. I want to breathe in my own space." The silence that followed was louder than anything I'd ever heard. I stood outside the door, my hands trembling, holding a tray with tea. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I quietly turned back to the kitchen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the street grow darker. I thought of all the years I had spent waiting for my son's happiness, saving for his education, cooking his favorite meals, praying through his exams, worrying through his illnesses. Every memory felt like a thread I had woven carefully into a fabric that now seemed to be unraveling from the other end. And still, I did not hate her. I couldn't. She was young, she was tired, and she was protecting her world the only way she knew how. But what I didn't understand was why love couldn't make room for me. Even a small corner, even a shared silence. The next morning, I looked in the mirror and saw lines I hadn't noticed before. Not wrinkles, lines of time, of learning, of loss. I smiled faintly at my reflection and said, "You'll be all right." But my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like someone older, someone who had learned that sometimes family doesn't end. It just changes shape until you don't recognize it. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that used to mean comfort, the smell of tea, the baby's soft laughter, sunlight spilling through the curtains. But that day, the air felt different, heavy, uncertain, like something waiting to fall. I woke up early. As always, I made tea, swept the veranda, and folded the dry clothes. The baby was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling gently. My son and daughter-in-law were in their room, voices low but tense. I tried not to listen, but the walls were thin. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Her voice cracked at the edges. "I feel like I'm walking on glass every day." He said something I couldn't hear, softer, almost pleading. Then her words came again, sharper now, clearer. "You don't understand. You say she's harmless, but her presence changes everything. I can't relax in my own house." I felt the teacup in my hand grow cold. I didn't want to hear more, but it's strange how the heart leans toward pain even when it wants peace. After a few minutes, the voices went quiet. I went back to the kitchen and stared at the wall. My eyes fell on the small crack near the stove, one I'd meant to fix weeks ago. I thought of how small cracks always begin invisible, and by the time you notice, they've already deepened beyond repair. When they came out, I smiled, pretending not to have heard anything. "Tea?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, thank you." My son took the cup quietly, but he didn't drink. The baby woke up then, and I went to her. She smiled when she saw me, her toothless mouth stretching into pure joy. I lifted her and kissed her forehead. The warmth of her skin brought tears to my eyes. I turned my face away so they wouldn't see. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law's mother came to visit. She was kind to me, always polite, but her eyes were sharp. She looked around the house, her gaze lingering on my chair in the living room. She sat down beside her daughter and spoke in a low voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the expressions: worry, frustration, something like decision. Later, after she left, my son called me to the living room. I wiped my hands on my dupatta and walked in. They were both standing. I felt it before they spoke. Some silences already tell you the words they carry. "Ma," my son began, "we've been thinking." He hesitated, glanced at his wife, then back at me. "Ria's been feeling very stressed. The doctor says she needs complete rest." And he paused again. "Maybe it's best if you take a short break, just for a while, maybe go stay at the old house, to rest too." I looked at him, at the boy who once clung to my hand crossing the road. His voice was gentle, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I smiled faintly. "A short break?" He nodded quickly. "Yes, Ma. Just for a few weeks. You'll be more comfortable there. It'll give her space, and you can have peace too." Peace. The word again. Always peace, as if my love was the storm. I turned to Ria. She stood straight, her arms folded, her lips pressed tightly together. I could see she wanted to speak, but perhaps guilt kept her silent. I said quietly, "Of course. I understand. You don't have to explain." "No, Ma, please don't take it that way," she said quickly, her voice softer now. "It's just for everyone's well-being. I know you've done so much. It's just things feel tense lately." I nodded again. "I see." That night, I sat on my bed and looked around the room. The baby's toys were scattered near the door. The small night lamp glowed softly. I began packing, not because they asked me to, but because I knew if I didn't leave, something between us would break completely. As I folded my clothes, I touched the blue shawl my husband had bought for me during our first winter together. It still smelled faintly of sandalwood. I wrapped it carefully. Then I picked up the photo frame from the bedside, my husband holding our son as a baby. I ran my thumb over their faces. "You see this?" I whispered to the photo. "This is how it happens, not through anger, not through shouting, through quiet choices made for peace." The baby woke up before dawn. She cried softly, and before I could reach her, Ria came rushing in. I stopped at the door, watching as she held the baby close. She didn't see me. The moonlight fell on her face. Tired, young, scared. I realized then that she wasn't my enemy. She was just another woman trying to build her own home, to feel in control of her world, the same way I once did. I went back to my room, sat down, and whispered, "You've done your part, Lada. Now let go." When morning came, my suitcase stood by the door. My son came out of the room, looking pale. "Ma, you don't have to go today," he said quietly. I smiled. "It's better if I do." He nodded slowly. "Let me at least call a taxi." I agreed. There was no point in refusing. I went to the baby one last time. She was lying on her back, gurgling, her tiny fists in the air. I kissed her forehead gently. "Be happy, my little one," I whispered, "and love your mother. She needs it." As I turned to leave, Ria stood near the doorway. Her eyes glistened. She said softly, "Ma, please don't think I hate you." I stopped, turned to her, and said, "No, child, you don't hate me. You just want to love your life your own way. And that's not a sin. She looked at me as if my words confused her. I smiled one last time and stepped out. The morning air touched my face, cool and kind. The taxi was waiting. My son carried my suitcase to the car. We didn't speak. As he placed it in the trunk, his hands trembled. I touched his shoulder and said, "It's all right, Betta. Don't make this harder." He looked up, eyes moist. "Ma, I just want everyone to be happy." I nodded. "I know." When I got into the taxi, he stood there watching. The engine started, and the road began to move beneath us. I looked at him through the window, his figure growing smaller, the house behind him turning into a blur. And I thought, love doesn't end when someone closes the door on you. It just changes its address. The taxi turned the corner, and the house disappeared from view. I felt my heart ache, but not from anger. It was a quiet ache, the kind that comes when you've lost something precious, but still wish the world well. As the city passed by outside, I rested my head against the window and whispered to myself, "This is the day my daughter-in-law turned my son against me." Then, after a pause, I added softly, or maybe this is the day life taught me that love sometimes means stepping away. The first few nights after I left their home were the hardest. The silence of the old house was heavy, even though I had known it before. It was different this time, not a silence of peace, but of absence. Every sound seemed to echo too loudly: the kettle's whistle, the creak of the chair, the chirping of birds outside. I would wake up in the middle of the night and, for a brief second, forget where I was. I would expect to hear the baby's soft cry, the sound of my son's footsteps, the faint murmur of the television from the living room. But then I would remember I was alone again. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the rooms, washed the curtains, and opened all the windows to let the air move freely. I watered the plants that had somehow survived my absence. Life, it seemed, found a way to continue quietly. Every evening, I sat near the window with my tea and watched the street below. Children played with marbles. Women gossiped near the water tap. An old man walked his dog. I watched it all, not as a part of it, but as a quiet observer. And in that stillness, I began to think, not about what I had lost, but about what I had learned. At first, I told myself I had been wronged, that I had given too much and received too little, that my daughter-in-law had stolen something from me, my place, my bond, my son. But as the days passed, those thoughts softened. The anger never came. Instead, understanding did, slow like sunlight filtering through clouds. One morning, I woke up early, just before dawn. The world was quiet except for the sound of birds beginning their song. I made tea and went outside to the small garden. The dew on the grass sparkled like tiny stars. I sat on the step and whispered to myself, she didn't take him away. She just needed him differently. And somehow, that sentence set something free inside me. I began to see their side more clearly. My son was not a betrayer. He was a man torn between two loves that demanded silence from him. My daughter-in-law was not cruel. She was a young woman trying to find balance in a world that expected her to please everyone. And I was a mother who had not yet learned that love must evolve, that it must know when to stay and when to let go. A week later, my phone rang. It was my son. His voice was careful, unsure, like someone stepping into a room full of fragile things. "Ma," he said softly, "how are you?" I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "I'm all right, Betta, how are you?" "And Ria?" "And the baby? They're good?" he said. Then, after a pause, Ria was asking about you. I didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, I just listened to his breathing. "Tell her I hope she's resting well," I finally said. He hesitated, then said, "Ma, I'm sorry. We didn't mean for things to happen like that." "It's all right," I said quietly. "You both did what you thought was right. Sometimes peace looks cruel before it becomes kind." He was silent. I could hear his breath catch a little. "We miss you," he said. I miss you too. I whispered. After that call, something gentle settled in me. The ache was still there, but it no longer burned. It was softer, like the scar after a healed wound. A reminder, not a pain. Days turned into weeks. I began going to the nearby temple every morning, not to pray for change, but to give thanks for what had been. I met a few women there, widows, mothers, grandmothers, all carrying their own small stories of love and loss. We would sit on the temple steps and talk about our children, our homes, our memories. There was laughter too, the kind that comes not from happiness, but from acceptance. One evening as I was returning home, I saw a small boy helping his grandmother cross the street. She held his hand tightly, and he slowed his steps to match hers. I stopped and watched them. Something inside me melted. I realized then that motherhood never really ends. It just changes form. Maybe my son no longer needed me in the same way, but someone else did. Even if that someone was just me, I started keeping a small diary. Each night before bed, I would write one sentence beginning with, "Today, I am thankful for." Some days, I wrote about the flowers blooming in my garden. Some days, I wrote about the memories that no longer hurt. And some nights, I simply wrote, "I am thankful for silence." Then one morning, there was a knock at the door. I opened it and saw my son standing there holding the baby. Behind him was Ria, looking uncertain, her hands fidgeting with the end of her dupatta. "Ma," he said softly, "we came to see you." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, looking at them, my family framed in the doorway like a photograph I thought I had lost. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The baby reached out her arms toward me. I took her, and she giggled, the same sound that used to fill my mornings. My son smiled, and Ria looked at me, her eyes wet. She said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." I touched her hand gently. "You didn't, child. You were just trying to find your place, and I was trying not to lose mine." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I pulled her into an embrace. For a moment, all the heaviness, all the distance vanished. There was only warmth, soft, human, real. We sat together that afternoon. I made tea, and she helped me set the table. My son played with the baby on the floor, laughing like he used to. The sunlight filled the small house, and for the first time in many months, it didn't feel lonely. As they were leaving, my son said, "You'll come visit soon, won't you?" I smiled. "Maybe, but don't worry, Beta, I'm right here. Home isn't just a place. It's the people we carry in our hearts." After they left, I stood by the window watching them walk away. The baby waving her tiny hand, Ria smiling faintly, my son glancing back one last time. The street shimmered in the evening light. I closed the door softly and whispered, "They are safe. They are loved. That's enough." That night, I wrote in my diary, "Today I forgave life for not being what I imagined, and it forgave me for holding on too long." Then I blew out the lamp, lay down, and listened to the crickets outside. The world was still the same, full of laughter, tears, love, and loss. But inside me, something had changed. There was peace now, not the kind forced by distance, but the kind born from understanding. And as I closed my eyes, I thought perhaps love doesn't end when people leave. It continues quietly, like the sound of rain long after the storm has passed. It has been a year since that day. The seasons have turned quietly, one folding into another like pages of a book I've finally learned not to rush through. My hair has grown grayer, my hands a little slower, but my heart feels lighter. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to hear a baby's cry or my son's footsteps, and for a moment, my chest tightens, but then I smile, because even if the sounds are gone, the love behind them remains. It lives in small things, in the way I still make 3 cups of tea in the morning, even if I only drink 1. In the way I set aside the softest fruits when I go to the market, just in case they visit. In the way I whisper their names during evening prayers. not out of longing anymore, but out of habit, a gentle, grateful kind of remembrance. The world outside continues as it always has. The neighbors' children still play cricket in the lane, their laughter spilling through the gate. The old vendor still calls out, his cart full of gavas and lemons. The air still smells of wet soil after rain. But inside me, the noise of hurt has faded into quiet acceptance. I have learned something precious, that love does not always mean holding on. Sometimes it means knowing when to step back, when to let the ones you love breathe without your shadow nearby. I used to think a mother's place was beside her children forever. But now I know a mother's place is in their heart, and that's enough. I often sit on the veranda during sunset, watching the sky turn gold and pink. The light touches everything softly, the plants, the walls, the old brass bell by the door. And I think of how life, too, has touched me, not always kindly, but always truly. Every ache, every silence, every tear, they were all lessons. They taught me that love is not something we own. It's something we offer freely, even when it's no longer returned in the same way. Once I believed my story ended the day my daughter-in-law turned my son against me. But now I see that it was only the beginning of another kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be seen, only felt. The kind that forgives quietly, without demand or proof. I've learned that peace doesn't come from being surrounded by the people you love. It comes from understanding that they are living their own stories, just as you are living yours. And sometimes those stories drift apart for a while, only to meet again when the time is right. Every few weeks, my phone rings. It's my son or Ria, or sometimes the baby, her tiny voice now forming words. She calls me Nanny in a tone that melts every bit of loneliness I've ever felt. They visit when they can, and when they do, we talk, we laugh, we share tea. There are no explanations anymore, no apologies. Just simple, steady love, quiet, forgiving, alive. The house feels full again during those visits. The baby's laughter fills the corners. My son sits by the window like he used to, and Ria helps me in the kitchen. Sometimes I catch her watching, her eyes soft, maybe wondering how I never got angry. I smile at her, and she smiles back, and that is enough. We don't need to talk about the past. We both know it was only life trying to teach us how to love differently. When they leave, I wave from the gate. The car disappears at the end of the lane, and the silence returns. But this silence is different now. Gentle, familiar, almost sacred. It wraps around me like an old shawl. I sit down, pour myself a cup of tea, and thank life for the people who stayed, and for the ones who left, and for the lessons that came in between. If there is one thing I have learned through all of this, it is that love changes form but never dies. It becomes distance, then memory, then peace. And if you let it, it will return to you in ways you never expect. A smile on a child's face, a phone call in the evening, a cup of tea that tastes like home. I sometimes whisper to the wind, you did well, Lada, you loved deeply, you lost quietly, and you learned to forgive. And the wind, kind and patient, carries my words away, maybe to them, maybe to nowhere, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that my heart no longer trembles when I remember, because in the end, life isn't about who hurt you or who stayed by your side. It's about how gently you learn to keep walking, even after the door closes, even after the voices fade. It's about choosing peace over bitterness, grace over pride, and love over everything else. And so when I close my eyes at night, I no longer replay the day I left that house. Instead, I remember the morning sunlight through the curtains, the baby's laughter, my son's gentle voice calling me, Ma. That is the story I choose to keep. The day my daughter-in-law turned my son against me was not the day I lost my family. It was the day I learned that love, real love, asks for no place, no return, no condition. It only asks that you keep it alive, quietly, faithfully in your heart. And that, I think, is what peace truly means.